Welcome to the Forging Honor podcast. I'm Jonathan George.
And I'm Benjamin Jones. Here at Forging Honor, we explore what it means to live as Christian men. Along the way, we'll be doing challenges, building habits and character through action.
Ben Scoones has worked in data science for 5 years and is currently Director of Data Science at Kathira Labs, working on AI development, vision, and strategy within the domain of healthcare data. Prior to this, he obtained his Master of Science from University College London in History and Philosophy of Science, with particular interests in causation, epistemology, and the philosophy of information. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thank you.
We're excited to have you here. Before we jump into our discussion and our questions that we have for you, what we always do here on Forging Honor is our challenge check-in. So as a reminder for listeners, challenges last for 6 weeks. That's a total of 42 days, 7 times 6. They are simple daily tasks to grow us as Christian men. And the current challenge is to turn your phone completely off for 1 hour every day. Banjo, how is it going for you?
Doing fairly well. This week was a little bit different. I don't know how much we want to make reference to this. It'll probably date our episode a little bit, but we're recording to the Tuesday after July 13th, which is when there was some pretty major events that happened. And I was doing really well on my phone, keeping my phone away, keeping my phone out of sight, out of mind. When kind of the news broke on Saturday about the presidential assassination attempt, and then I was on my phone pretty regularly from there, and I thought that was actually kind of interesting, and maybe something at some point we could talk about here, just the way that that we're wired now to look for certain kinds of information, and when a big event has happened, that immediately there's kind of a place to go. So I've been more hooked up to my phone over the weekend, due to some of the late breaking events, as they say. I've also noticed, maybe we can talk about this some, more kind of crazy speculation about this event than I've kind of ever seen before about an event. I mean, it's kind of like almost immediately after the events, there was like this kind of a JFK grassy knoll, where was the second shooter kind of a thing. And I wonder how much of that comes from just the abundance of information and technology we have. But that's my tinfoil hat hour. We can save that for later. JJ,
Sure.
How have you been doing with the challenge?
Really well, actually. So I took, our last guest we had last week, Ben, a young man who had switched completely to a light phone. I don't know if you're familiar with the light phone. It's like a dumb phone, essentially. He'd switched completely. So I took some inspiration. I've swapped my SIM into a dumb phone that I had, Banjo, and my smartphone has been off in a work bag in case I need it for work, which I've only had to pull it out once in the last week. So that's been fun. And I'm still putting away the dumb phone even for an hour at least. And so that's been good. With like you said, though, it was interesting. We got a group text on Saturday, like, have you heard the news? I was like, I have no idea. Normally I would know exactly what someone's talking about. So it was a couple hours before I had time to pull out my laptop and like find out what was going on. So people had to tell me. But that was interesting. At any rate.
One other thing I forgot to say, your light phone thing reminded me, I did try grayscale this week.
Oh, cool.
That was something based off of our last conversation I tried. I actually found it just really annoying in general, because I spent about the same amount of time on my phone and there just wasn't any color. So I don't know if I'll keep that trend.
The point is the annoyance. That's the whole point. Like, you got to do that.
Well, I was annoyed, but it didn't decrease my time at all. So it just felt kind of like it felt like a wash, you know? So anyway, that's a side note.
Well, good. Well, I'm excited to learn from you, Ben. I think, you are certainly more knowledgeable than I in the realm of computer science. I have a bachelor's in computer science. You, on the other hand, are a master of science. So you're leagues ahead of me here.
Master of science, not of computer science.
That's fair. At any rate, I've appreciated. We've had conversations before, and I've appreciated your clarity of thought, and I'm excited to learn from that. So go ahead and give us kind of a quick outline of your story, what interests you in data science, how you got to where you are, and what you're currently working on.
Yes. So, well, I originally went to school for chemistry. And so I actually did a master's first in that. And it was during that final year where the emphasis really shifts to being very practical and very kind of lab focused that I decided that was not the career for me. I enjoyed the theoretical aspect of that, the problem solving. Really did not enjoy actually being in a lab,
Right.
kind of doing experiments or whatever. Right, not the experiment part so much as handling chemicals, I guess, and getting in a lab jacket with the gloves and glasses and all that. So once I graduated from that, I became a Christian actually pretty much immediately after graduating, and then started studying apologetics after reading some C.S. Lewis books. And during that time was when I started to read more about, well, actually I started reading a lot of Discovery Institute stuff. And that kind of got me onto information theory, and from there, philosophy of information, philosophy of science, because that was something that Steve is very, I mean, he did his PhD in philosophy of science. So that kind of opened that door to me because I loved the philosophy side of that. And it meshed well, obviously, with my science background. And so I thought, okay, this is what I want to pursue. So once I finished up my year of studying apologetics and theology, I then, did the master's in history and philosophy of science, and really, really loved doing that. And that kind of settled really where I wanted to go in terms of at least the type of work that I wanted to be doing. Right, something more theoretical, something problem solving. And particularly was interested in the field of causation. And so, fast forward a year after that, and was looking for work, and data science just seemed like a great marriage of those things. It combines the experimentation of science with the problem solving of working practically with the data, and obviously coding as well. And then kind of the philosophical side of thinking about, well, where's my data come from? What are the assumptions that maybe underpin this when the person was gathering it or in its use, right? What are people thinking that is true of this, which maybe is not true? Or what are people assuming about the domain that they're trying to apply that data to, or the insights that they've taken from that data, trying to apply that to a particular domain? Are there maybe flaws in the way that they're doing that, or the way that they're thinking about that? And so that just seemed like a great option to me. So started studying that through some online courses, and then got a job a few months later. And then that's kind of the history.
Very cool. So you kind of gave already a short understanding of what data science is, but if you had to define it more broadly and to give, at least in layman's terms, so someone understands, what are you doing as a data scientist?
Yeah, it's pretty broad. I mean, really, I'd probably say, but people will give themselves that title or that profession really for any number of things. Probably really the only thing that unites them is something that, is a focus on the data, right? But broadly within data science, or, that kind of data technology field, I suppose, is kind of a few categories. So one would maybe be a data analyst, where your focus is more on deriving insights from data as it already exists, particularly aimed at business use cases. And then another is maybe data engineering, where your focus is more kind of on the ETL pipeline, right? How are you getting data from A to B? Are you getting it there in the form that you need it to be in? And where do you want to store it? What are some challenges around that? And how are you running those pipelines in production? So a little bit more engineering-y on that side. And then kind of, I wouldn't say in the middle of those things, but data science is kind of working on top of, I guess, what the engineers are working to build, which is this data system or this data model that you have, where you're, hopefully either using that data again you might be solving a business problem with that, but maybe in a way that's a little bit more, I don't know. I don't want to be unfair to a data analyst and say this, but maybe in a way that's a little bit more complex. Maybe you're building something a little bit new, going beyond just what's in the raw data, trying to enrich it in some way. or it's building a completely new data product or data pipeline or something like that. Ultimately, trying to add more value to what's already there for a customer or for the business or whatever it might be. And typically, data science out of those three is where you're going to be building models, building predictive models. But now people are calling themselves ML engineers, machine learning engineers, and things like that. So, you've got this proliferation of these titles, but that's kind of, broadly speaking, what those different categories do. And so I'm definitely in that, for me, that middle camp where early on when I started in data science, I was building a lot of models for a lot of different people. I was actually working on a platform to do kind of a no-code solution for people who wanted to build predictive models with their data. And now it's, and then maybe for 2.5 years, it was very much focused on building data pipelines and adding value to the raw data that was already there for particular purposes. And now it's kind of shifted to being more focused on AI and AI applications using data. And so even for me, a little bit of a transition between those roles, although really, they're all similar.
Right. Well, and AI I can see how that fits in very neatly to the role you currently have. That's definitely the buzzword right now. The boom is happening in the world of AI. And you mentioned it's funny, there are folks calling themselves machine learning engineers, or I've seen like the prompt engineers are a thing now, where they're like coming up with inputs for the AI. And so it's kind of funny to me. But there's an interesting I can't pronounce that word off the top of my head now. There's an interesting spreading out of all this data and all this information. We're going to find another word instead of proliferation. You said it right. There we go. But as Banjo was mentioning earlier, like there's just all this information out there. So kind of wanted to get into some of the root ideas of what is information. So you mentioned in your bio that you have interests in causation, epistemology, and the philosophy of information. So could you give us a very broad overview of, one, what those terms are for those that might not know, and then kind of underpinning, like, what are different philosophies of information?
Yes. So you want causation, epistemology, and
yes. Just give us kind of an overview of where, a broad overview so that someone can kind of understand, once we get into the conversation about AI, some of the definitions of what we're talking about.
Sure. So causation, funnily enough, is a definition that people debate, which is probably true of pretty much everything. That. Yeah. So
that's the nature of philosophy, right? You got to debate it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And people do. Whether or not there's a lot of value in all of that is another question. But causation one is kind of interesting. I think probably the easiest way, which maybe is not like the most direct way, I guess, but is if something had not happened, then some other thing would also not have happened.
Okay.
Right. So if the billiard ball hadn't, if the cue ball hadn't struck the red ball would not have moved. Right.
Right.
And if that's true, then the cue ball caused the red ball to move. Right.
So that we would not say that we would never observe the red ball moving completely on its own.
Well, so this is kind of the part of the problem with that definition. It's like, okay, well, that means the cue ball is a sufficient condition for the red ball moving.
Sure.
Under most circumstances.
Okay.
But it's not the only thing that can cause the red ball to move.
Right.
And how do you know that the cue ball hitting the red ball is actually what is causing the red ball to move? Maybe there's something else going on there that we don't understand. But I think it's just one of those things. You know it when you see it, and unless you're Humean in your view of that, then which I think, to be honest, I am to some degree. But,
oh, interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think when it really comes down to it, how do you actually prove those things?
Right.
And so when you're having that kind of conversation, like, I do subscribe to that, but on a more practical note, like, I think you can, anyone can pretty easily see, at least in most situations, A is causing B, right? They can see that this thing preceded this other thing happening, and it was related, and that it caused the second thing to occur.
So it sounds like you'd say causation is a real thing. Exactly what it is might be hard to pin down, but we know it is a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're really
fine.
going for a super robust definition, you maybe will struggle, or you'll have some debate there.
Okay.
But yeah.
And what interests you about that in the world of data science?
Well, the interest in that definitely preceded the interest in data science. But I think really when you're doing predictive modeling, you in a way are making an assumption that traditionally, before you even get into ML, you had statistical models, right? So you'd have, let's just say it's a linear regression problem, right? So you've got a relationship between what you would call the independent variables and the dependent variable, meaning the thing that you're trying to predict, whether that's like number of ice cream sales or something like that, that's the dependent variable that is dependent on these other things that you're looking at to try and predict your ice cream sales. So the independent variables in that case might be something like the temperature outside, the price of an ice cream, the location of that particular store, something like that, right? I mean, you'd have to convert the location into some kind of quantitative thing, but those would be your inputs, and then the dependent variable. In a way, you're kind of assuming that there's a causal relationship between those things.
Okay, that makes sense.
You don't necessarily need for that to be the case, right? You can have correlative relationships between things where one doesn't cause the other, but one does indicate the other, right?
Well, it's like in that example, it's a real world phenomenon where as ice cream sales increase, so do murders.
Oh, really?
Yep. And there's a theory that it has something to do with one of the factors you already mentioned of heat. As heat goes up, people more readily become angry.
Oh, really? There you go. So you've got
parsing that out, right?
Yep. Yep. I should have brought another book along. Oh well.
Oh.
But that's. I think a lot of people are very familiar with that concept of correlation and not causation, right? That's a fairly kind of trite phrase, but it is true. And I think it's, I guess, just particularly interesting to me to explore. So, in data science, in a way, you're trying to build a system of knowledge, right? By looking at data. And based on that data, you're going to form certain theories about things, right? You're going to have your hypotheses and you're going to try and prove them or disprove them based on the data, or you're going to use it to inform your decision in something, right? So, and that kind of relates to epistemology. And so then that's kind of, the relationship between causation and epistemology is also just a very interesting one, right? How do you develop knowledge of something as being properly causal, right? And not just correlated with one another. So that relationship is very natural. And then I think, like I said, kind of naturally relates to data science in that way, where with data science, again, you're building that system of knowledge or using information to try and, like I say, form theories about different things.
Okay. And that kind of gets us to philosophy of information there. When you say philosophy of information, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean philosophy of, study of,
sure,
theory of, whatever. So philosophy of information, what is information is kind of the key question there.
Interesting.
And I think really this kind of developed from the mathematical theory of communication that was developed by Claude Shannon in, I can't remember when it was, the 50s, I think.
A while ago.
The 60s.
Before our time.
And so that is, that's kind of the idea that how much information content is present in a message or in some event. And, Claude Shannon being a mathematician, the mathematical theory of communication, really tried to quantify that. And the way that he defined it, there are other ways of defining it, but the way that he defined it was the information content of an event is essentially the reduction in uncertainty that occurs when that event happens. So if you flip a coin, there are two possible outcomes and they're each equally likely. And so when that occurs, you are reducing, 50% of the possible event space or whatever you want to call it.
After you flip the coin.
Yeah, once you see the outcome.
Right.
And so that is one bit of information. is a coin flip. And you can do the same thing with communication and with language, where and people do use this as an application of that theory. Is if you were to send a message in natural language and you've got a certain number of letters, like how far do you need to kind of degrade that that message before it no longer is meaningful in communicating its purpose, right?
So when you say degrade, you mean like just adding on so much information that it becomes?
No, so like taking away some components of it, adding in things that aren't meaningful or weren't originally there, that kind of thing.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so anyway, so that was the genesis of information theory, I suppose, and then philosophy of information is really, I suppose, trying to broaden that out so it's not so mathematical, strictly speaking, but more thinking about the nature of information in general. And so there's one definition that I kind of like, which is by a guy called Luciano Floridi. And I think he wrote this, it's probably about 10 years ago now. But his was, what is it? I think it's meaningful, well-defined data is information.
So information is not simply a fact, like there's a microphone in front of your face, but there's it has to be meaningful and well-defined in some way.
Yeah, so well-defined kind of means well-structured, right?
Okay.
So it obeys the syntax of the system that you're in. So with language, there are certain rules for language. Mm-hmm. With mathematics, there are certain rules for mathematics and how you compose those statements. So that's kind of the well-formed. And then meaningful is, kind of self-explanatory, right? Does it have relevant content that you actually care about or that you can extract from it? So in this case, like with the microphone, that's you saying, I can see this microphone. That is a datum, right? That's a data point that you're looking at. And then you would go from there to maybe creating some kind of more meaningful statement about what's present there.
Well, and it might be considered meaningful if you can act on it. Like there's something in front of you that you can speak into, versus just kind of coming up with ideas here. If I were to shout something about, I don't know, there's a stork outside, is that meaningful in any way? Is that any information there is there information being conveyed?
Yeah, I think exactly. I kind of want to grab my book and grab an example from there. Is that okay? All right. It's been a long time since I read this.
Yeah, you can bring those over here and set them down if you need to.
I don't think I'll need the others.
Okay. Well, I saw there were some AI books there too.
Yeah.
That'd be interesting. And I know Banjo has a lot of questions about AI. He's terrified about his job being taken by AI.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Cool. Well, I'm here.
End of the world as we know it, but I feel fine.
Yeah.
You should feel fine. Yeah. All right. Let me see. Okay. So here we go. So this is a general definition of information. Something is a datum is an instance of information understood as semantic content, so meaningful content. Mm-hmm. If and only if that datum consists of n data, where n is equal to or greater than 1, the data are well-formed and the well-formed data are meaningful. So let me see if I can find an example here. So here we go. Meaningful means the data must comply with the meanings, semantics of the chosen system code or language in question. So once again, semantic information is not necessarily linguistic. In the case of the car's operation manual, the illustrations are supposed to be visually meaningful to the reader. So there you go. And then let me see, well-formed. Well-formed means the data are rightly put together according to the rules, the syntax that govern the chosen system.
Okay. That makes sense. It might be, if you got a set of Lego instructions and then you ripped out all the pages, reordered them, it would no longer be well-formed, right? And if you followed them in that order, what you got might not be meaningful. Is kind of what versus if you had them in the right order and you follow them step by step, you could come up with a Lego spaceship or something, and it would be.
Sounds like if you had a Lego set in front of you, but you were reading IKEA instructions, that could be another example. The information there would not be meaningful to what you had in front of you.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I guess
is that around?
Well, I think that's fine. Maybe another way I would put it is, so you could have. I'm going to expose my lack of understanding of English grammar, but you've got some components to a sentence, right? And so you've got nouns, you've got adjectives, you've got verbs, you've probably got some other stuff. And
there's a few other things in there.
So those are your syntactic components, right? And equally, they also typically go together in a certain order, right? So an adjective is going to precede a noun typically.
Often.
Yeah, exactly. So this is where my particular example falls down. But that's the syntax, and then the meaningful, I think, is really saying something like, well, you can have a word in there, but if that word is just gibberish, that's not meaningful. It doesn't actually convey anything about the noun that it's acting upon.
Yeah, if I were to say something like the gobbledygook gloomed, like that, even though in the way I used those words, the syntax was correct, I used gobbledygook as a noun.
Yeah,
but that's a meaningless word. So
that's actually actually, it's funny. I was just reading a book on this actually.
Oh boy, Banjo! Just read a book.
I just read a book, as a nerd does, called "How to Write a Sentence and How to Read It." And one of the interesting facts about sentences, and I think this relates because we're talking about information. You can actually have a sentence that has seemingly non-meaningful words, but if the seemingly non-meaningful words follow the relationship rules within a sentence, you can make sense of that sentence.
Well, I mean,
the famous example is like the Jabberwock poem by Lewis Carroll.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about that, right? There's enough there. And this is kind of, to some degree, relates to the mathematical theory of communication, right? Like there are some things that are correct in that you haven't completely lost the sense of what that sentence was trying to communicate. You've lost some of it, but you can still pick up on a little bit of it. And so that's kind of interesting, right? Like, so these are the kind of things that are fun to think about when you're trying to define what's informative, what's the content there that's being communicated. So I find that very interesting.
And how clear does it need to be, and how, like, just levels to it, even like, does it technically qualify as information, even if it's 80% useless? There could be questions there of how good is the data.
Well, maybe can I ask a question that maybe will tie us down a little bit?
Sure.
Because I'll be honest, you two are very smart computer science people, engineering, software, whatnots. And I'm swimming in the deep end. So I am just like, somebody throw me a rope or something. I love the philosophy talk though. That is right in my wheelhouse.
Good stuff.
But as you've been talking, Ben, I've been thinking about just it seems like your job, your specialty is to dig into this information and to help people to discern what is meaningful. I wanted to ask, in general, do you find, how good are we at this? How good are people in general at discerning the quality of their information? And how good maybe do we need to be? Like, this is maybe to what JJ was asking a little bit, but what's an acceptable level of information gathering, I guess? Are we anywhere near as good at it as we need to be I won't get to as a society. Let's just go with people.
Yeah. Well, I'll say firstly, I guess, if you're struggling to grasp it, then I think that's not your failing. I think that's mine. It's,
you're doing great. You're doing great.
I don't think I'm explaining it all that well, and so all that to say, don't blame yourself. Blame me for that. And if anyone listening is struggling, then blame me as well. But you can read the book. There's a very short introduction to information, which is very interesting, written by Luciano Floridi. In terms of how good are we, I think that's an interesting question. So for me, and something I find interesting about philosophy of information is it's not just questions like that. It's thinking really, when you start thinking about it, information is kind of the foundation for a lot of other things. And so Discovery Institute, obviously that's kind of one of their key things. You can see information everywhere, right? In terms of how the economy is developing and behaving. You can see it in the fossil record. You can see it in observing natural phenomena and scientific experiments, things like that. It bleeds into all of this stuff, and it even bleeds into causation. There's my favorite theory of causation is that it's transfer of information that causes something. That metaphysically, that is what causation is. And I like that theory because it actually deals with a lot of problems of other theories of causation, which I won't get into here.
Well, there's a really fascinating biblical component to that. If we're all made of, or if all of reality originates from the word of God, as a spoken word, information is the very first thing that God uses to create reality.
Yeah, well,
so there's an interesting connection there. That's fun to think about. I don't know how accurate or how heretical we could be in 5 minutes, but
well, so I want to get back to the question, but so there's a book by Bill Dembski called "Being as Communion," and that kind of is his. Well, hopefully, I'm not misrepresenting his theory by saying this, but that kind of is his view of reality, I suppose, as information is like the fundamental stuff. And there's a religious component to that as well. Because really it's everything exudes it, right? Like it is what makes something, right? You cannot do anything without there being information generated by it. And, a simple example of that is, if you imagine nothing, then even imagining nothing implies the existence of something, right?
Right.
It implies the opposite of that. And so then you've got a datum because you've got a thing and its negation, right? And that's true of so many things.
What does that imply for, and this might start to get into Banjo's question a little bit about gathering information. What does that imply for things about which there only is information in terms of, you don't, kind of separating the definition of information from an object. There might be a table in front of you, and yes, there's information that you can derive from that, but to most people, like, they don't think, oh, the table existing is information. But there are other concepts where it's only information that we're talking about. Concepts of the spiritual world, for example, which you can get into how much that's interacting in our lives, but no one has observed God the Father. So that there's questions there about that relationship of our ability to marry the physical world with the informational world.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call it the informational world so much as material and immaterial. And both just by virtue of existing, effectively, like they kind of quote unquote generate information. So the table example, that's kind of
we don't have to get into that if that
ways.
Starts to get.
Well, I guess it depends how much time you guys want to devote to it.
I'm happy to spend as much time as you have, but I want to be respectful of your time as well.
No, it's okay. It's fun. That's what I'm here for. But the table kind of in itself is like a collection of data, right? Kind of, but you might be able to glean something from that. So you might be able to get something meaningful from that in some context. And we kind of talked about that earlier, right? Like me looking at, and so this is something else that kind of comes into it is, when you're talking about information, it doesn't just exist in an ether. Something's not intrinsically that way, but when someone observes it, that kind of makes it meaningful to them. So when you observe this table, then there's something meaningful to you about it, right? But that could be different in different contexts, depending on what features of the table you're after. So that's one thing I would say. Like in itself, the table is I wouldn't call it information. It's a material thing. But it has certain characteristics, and it interacts with the world and with you in different ways. And the content of that is kind of what's informative, right? So I could make a statement about the table, and that would be conveying information to you or to Banjo if Banjo can't see it, right?
Right.
And then equally, like, what is the definition of a table? Well, then you're getting into a whole other kind of debate there,
right?
I guess. But there's information content there as well in that definition.
Okay. I think we're starting to get somewhere with that. But back to Banjo's question with how good are we actually doing that?
Yeah. So, yeah. So,
And maybe
sorry, I
one question
interrupted
on
you,
that
Banjo.
as well. Part of the reason I'm asking is one of the things that I've been looking at is been thinking about the phones and what is the upside of a phone? Why is it good that we have this technology? You know, the big thing that people say is, well, we have more access to information than ever before. And I guess part of the question there is, does that necessarily mean it's a good thing? Does more information necessarily equate to a better world? But maybe that's a different question entirely.
well, man, so many interesting things. So on that point, I would say, I guess it depends what you mean by more information. There is more data, but it's another thing to say there's more information. I think there is more information as well, but those two things are not the same. So you could write the same sentence 1,000 times. So this is another definition of information. I think it was Gregory Chaitin, who's a mathematician, that proposed this one. But he said that the information content of is it a number? Is it just a thing? I can't remember, but it's basically like the length of the function required to produce it, right? So in mathematics, you have, let's take pi, for example, right? You've got an irrational number there that goes on infinitely and it doesn't recur. But he says pi doesn't contain infinite information because you can compute it with a finite program. Right. And that makes a lot of sense to me, right? Because everything needed to define pi to any level of specificity you desire is right here in this little program. And this is where it gets really wacky. But, you know, there are things like that which you cannot do that for, which do contain infinite information.
What's an example?
Well, we can't know them because they're infinite. So he's proposed one which is called Chaitin's number, which maybe a bit closer. Which I honestly cannot remember well enough, so I won't even. I'll try and give a definition of it, but if you really want to know about it, you can read about it in his book Conversations with a Mathematician, which is a really just incredibly interesting book. But so his number, which I think he represents with the symbol omega, I think, is infinite in length, and it basically contains, each digit represents, I think, I want to say like each digit is either 0 or 1, and it is whether a particular problem is solvable or not solvable or something like that.
So it's like remember. All problems summed up in one number.
Yeah. So I'm definitely hazy on the details there.
Or not all problems, but whether it's the question of all problems of whether they are all solvable or not.
Maybe
it sounds like, based on what you're saying, but I don't
know. I don't want to commit to anything.
See, the quality of our information being conveyed through two sources now. So it's like the game Telephone.
It's definitely that the information content there is questionable, but I can tell you where to find it, which is in that book. Anyway, so since I had kids, I've started like, if I start talking too long, I forget what I was talking about.
Fair enough.
So you got to remind me, where were we with that? What was the original?
My question was, typically we think of our phone-centric world as giving us more information than ever before. Sounds like that might be called into question, whether or not it's given us more information. But secondly, maybe more importantly, is that increase of information, is that actually a good thing, or are we doing more harm than good?
Yes. So, so definitely, like I said before, definitely an increase in data. And I think, yes, an increase in the amount of information available. But questionable how easy that information is to extract, right? So another thing that Floridi talks about is, how do you contrast information with misinformation or disinformation, right? So statements which are meaningful and well-formed, which are false. So that's like the final part of the definition of information, is it needs to be true, at least how he defines it. I'm not sure whether I agree with that or not, but He would say information has to be true, right? And so misinformation, disinformation is false, or like, I don't know, meaningless in some other way. And I think definitely what we have now is, just a huge, colossal, really inconceivable amount of data. And wrapped up in that is definitely more information, but you've got to be able to disentangle it from all of the misinformation or all of the disinformation that surrounds it, and all the noise as well, right? You've got to extract the signal from the noise in all of that. And it's so I saw, I think Google did a survey. Well, so I guess I'll say it's interesting to see how generationally the way that people do that is different now to how it was with our parents' generation or with our grandparents' generation. Because now, I mean, I'm not a Zoomer in spirit or by age, but people now, kids now.
Hey, we prefer the term iGen. No, I'm kidding.
Kids now will, one of the ways, or the primary way they get their information, at least about, social events and things like that. So social events, that makes it sound like parties, but, real world events,
Sure.
Is through social media, or, whether that's YouTube, whether that's Facebook, whether that's, I don't know, whatever else is Instagram, right? TikTok, I don't know, all those things. I don't subscribe to any of that stuff, except for YouTube. I do like YouTube, but anyway, they will try and find creators or influencers that they like and that they trust, and that's kind of their filter for looking at that information, and they will trust that source. Well, whether or not it's ultimately correct, right? They found a source that they trust. And another interesting thing about that survey was, and I actually find myself doing this too, is the way that they engage with those things is not necessarily to listen to them or to read them. It is to look at the comments that people are making about them, so that they should know what they should think about what that person has said. And I find that extremely interesting. And I think, you talked about the Trump assassination attempt kind of at the start of this. This is kind of one example of, well, you can see how this situation might have been made more possible by that type of thing. If you only trust certain people, and those people are espousing views which say something like, Trump is, a new age Hitler, and this is what his second presidency is going to mean for the country. And that's the only thing that you're seeing. That's the only filter that you're subscribing to, or that you're getting your information from. You can kind of see, and particularly if that's reinforced by other sources, right, which are also making it through your net, right. You can see how that would kind of reinforce those ideas in you. You come to believe them even more strongly, and maybe even more extremely, right? Maybe that's something that, this is just me speculating, but maybe that's something that leads to that polarization and extremization. I don't know what the word is, that, pushing views to the...
I was watching a video from Simon Sinek, I think a couple of years ago when he said this, but actually, I'm thinking about it. The video was from, I think, 2016, which looks perfectly quaint now in 2024. But he basically said the effect of social media and of iPhone technology has been to create basically a sort of solitary confinement with our information and with our understanding of ourselves, where everybody is siloed into their own kind of own reality. And I thought that was really interesting. Maybe a question here is, to what extent does our understanding of information rely on other people? How much of our understanding of how good our information is, how much does that require of us to put down our phones or to get out of our social bubbles that we have kind of concocted for ourselves? How much do we need other people in this conversation?
Ooh, Well, being maybe the personality I am, off the cuff, I'm going to say, having some external feedback is important. But probably what I'd emphasize is not necessarily other people, although that can be valuable to kind of get other people's perspectives on things. But it's more thinking about the method, right? I mean, it's not. You do have to divine these days what is true and what is not. It's not so clear because you've got these just drastically, like you've got CNN headlines saying like Trump fell over or whatever. Someone said that. Maybe it wasn't CNN.
It was hilarious to
yeah.
read.
So you've got stuff like that, and then you've got obviously on the other side like I don't know, conspiracy theories like this was a Secret Service job. I don't know. I don't know if anyone's saying that, but you can imagine it.
Right. People are saying all kinds of crazy things.
Yeah. Yes, they are. And so what do you do as an observer of that? Well, you can talk to other people, but I think the best thing is honestly just to use common sense and just to think about like, well, what's the foundation of my knowledge, right? When when I'm seeing these things, like in this case, you can watch the video, you can see what happened, you can view things that are more or less objective, right? So someone might be writing an opinion piece, or someone might have posted a video of their perspective of the event online. Obviously, these days you can fake some stuff, but I don't think you need to be a genius to figure out what's right and what's wrong. But I think you do need to, I guess, just be mentally switched on, be willing to question your assumptions that you're making. And I think particularly something that is important to think about is, when people are making those selections of who's going to make it through their filter and who they're going to trust for their information, they're not making them on the basis of thinking that source is reliable or trustworthy necessarily. They're making it on the basis of, or at least, probably most of the time, they're making it on the basis of who they like, right? Do they like the views that this person is putting forward, or do they dislike them? And obviously, there's not a connection necessarily between those two things, right? You don't always like what's true. I mean, going back to the Bible, what was I going to say about that? Well, so
you don't like what's true necessarily.
Well, you think, I'm showing this person, you do apologetics or whatever, and you say, okay, well, here's the argument for God, here's the argument for the Christian faith,
Mm-hmm.
here's some scripture that I can point you to, which you would think would comport with reality for this person, right? And also you would think they would be able to see using logic that this thing is true, right? But they're suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, right? Mm-hmm. And in these, I don't know if that's exactly true when you're picking what news source you want to subscribe to, but I think it's a similar thing, right? Like you can find data points to support pretty much anything you want to believe, and so long as you're willing to ignore a bunch of stuff in the process, right? So something to keep in mind with
right.
that.
Well, and that's assuming you're even wanting to seek out true information.
Right.
I think that kind of the nature of the way the internet is presented to us, we're not necessarily approaching it with an intent. Now, a lot of people do, but not everyone does. A lot of people do not approach this in the sense of, I want to go learn something. It's, what am I going to consume today? And they're just taking in whatever's on their feed. At least I've done that plenty of times in my life, and I feel like that can't be a just Jonathan experience right there. But
I get it all through my wife. My wife is my filter.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
So.
That's a wise man right there. But there's a sense in which you could question the value of that information purely because while the information might actually be well put together and it might be at least somewhat meaningful, right? It can't just exist in a vacuum for it to be meaningful, right? If the person doesn't ever respond to it, if they're just consuming it and taking it, what does that mean about the quality of that information at the end of the day?
Well, I mean, I guess for that person, it's obviously not communicating the same thing. I mean, in a vacuum, you give it to someone else, it's doing something different. If you're strictly speaking about the quality of information,
well, that gets to the question of the causation earlier as well. Oh, the effect of the effect of information on different people, how it might be more meaningful to one person.
Well, I would say the effect of data on different people.
Okay, this is again. We're going to keep doing this, saying data versus information.
Because it's there's always like. I think this is the merit of saying information has to be true, right? Because then you can more clearly define what the information content of a statement is.
Interesting.
If it's false, then you can say, well, the information content is 0, right? But if it's true, then you can say exactly what true statement is being communicated by this thing, and then you can look at other people and say, did you get that from this? Did you get that from this? And if not, then for them, there was no information transfer, right? Or whatever.
Interesting.
At least not of that type, not of the intended type, let's say, because there's always. If I say something to you, it's still going to affect you in some way, even if you don't, even if it's not my intention with what I said.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of fun thought experiments that could be done. We could go down a rabbit hole for a very long time on that, for sure. Yeah. But in the world of data and the world of information, I would like to move towards talking about some of the AI stuff that's happening now, some of the concerns that Banjo has for the state of the English language and its development.
I'm not as scared as you think I am, but we'll get to that.
Okay. Anyway, first off, kind of back to some definitions. What even is AI? People toss that out there like they know what they're talking about. But define AI for us.
Well, it depends on who you're talking to. It's a little bit, I wouldn't say nebulous, but there's a lot of, I wouldn't say equivocation either. It's not exactly equivocation, but different people use it to encompass different things. Okay. I think, more strictly speaking, there are really kind of two types of AI. You have weak AI and you have strong AI. And weak AI is kind of exactly what we see now, which is essentially technology which is performing, some kind of human-like cognitive function, like an LLM would, right? So you ask it a question and it gives you a response.
Right, and an LLM is a large language model, right?
Yes, okay. Yeah, correct.
Just in case folks don't know.
Yeah.
And so what is that doing? A weak AI, what is that doing under the hood?
Well, I'll say about strong AI first.
Okay, go for it.
So that's weak AI. So yeah, weak AI exists, right? And these days, really, AI kind of people use that term really to refer to pretty much anything in machine learning. I don't particularly like that. I feel like it's a little bit, almost feels like it obfuscates a little bit exactly what's happening in some instances, right? Like if I just build a statistical model and the relationship, again, is defined in a purely statistical way, then, well, which really is true of all of these models, right, ultimately. But that's not really, I don't know, that's not really AI, right? That's kind of like pretty basically just math. Whereas something like, so, that ice cream sales prediction, right?
Right.
Like you want to call that AI, that feels a little bit disingenuous to me.
Have you seen the, maybe it's XK DC or can't remember who it was like a comic where it's a crack on the wall, and it's a crack on the wall, and then someone comes and puts a picture frame around it and writes machine learning, and then someone else comes and does a whole presentation in front of it and calls it AI, artificial intelligence. And it's like this step from it's just a thing on the wall to now it's art to now it's this wonderful thing that we're all going to talk about. And that sounds exactly like what you're talking about. Yeah,
I think there's a little bit of that. So I guess for me, like I want to push against that a little bit with like that definition. I mean, because I think it just makes people think something's happening that really is not happening.
Right.
It's more like what other impressions are rolled up into that phrase or to that term. Strong AI is kind of like people start calling it kind of artificial general intelligence, right? So an AI that actually is like properly conscious and can properly think and make decisions and things like that. And, some people think that is possible and achievable. I do not.
Just going to go ahead and drop that right there for everybody.
I don't feel like it needs justifying.
Ben Scoones, no AGI.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, maybe I should look up the definition of artificial general intelligence, but
Sure.
because maybe that just means like a whole bunch of different tasks. I don't know. I can't really remember, but definitely not strong AI, right? Like you're never going to get consciousness arising from a machine, right? From nothing. You're not going to get consciousness ex nihilo.
Right. We
right?
can't play God.
Yeah, and there's some more philosophical stuff we could throw in there about why I believe that or what you would require for that to happen, but yeah, I'll save that.
Okay.
So what was your question?
with the weak AI, specifically some of the more complex machine learning, some of the LLMs that are happening, like what's going on under the hood?
Well, really, it's all just math. So you have like I said, so something like linear regression, just a basic statistical model where you're essentially building a mathematical equation to predict this thing, and you'll have one term per independent variable. So if I'm using three things to predict my ice cream sales, then I'll have three terms in my equation. I'll have one product, right? Which is the thing I'm trying to predict.
Right.
And then if you go to machine learning, well, you're looking at you could put that in the machine learning class. Again, I think all of these, it's all just taxonomy. You can debate taxonomy for days. But machine learning, you're using different types of algorithms for doing essentially the same type of thing, right? You're still ultimately trying to make a prediction. You might even be using the same inputs, but the method that you're using to do that is going to be potentially a little bit different. So a simple example of a machine learning algorithm would be a decision tree. In this case, if we're doing ice cream sales, it would be a decision tree regressor, which means it's predicting something which is not a categorical variable, right? Has essentially an infinite number of potential values that it can output, all right, versus a classifier which is going to predict either like true or false or red, white, blue, whatever, some kind of like limited number of possible outcomes. So a decision tree is really going to kind of look like a flow diagram, right? So like, is this condition met? If yes, then is this other condition met? If yes, then here's my prediction. And you build up that tree based on the information that you have in your data set that you've used for training your model. And then when you move on to something like an LLM, well, that's really a particular type of deep learning model. And so that's where you're using, you're essentially imitating the functioning of the human brain or the architecture of the brain,
right?
And representing that in a mathematical form with nodes and with connections between those nodes to solve your problem. So a kind of a simple architecture for that would be you've got your inputs, your three inputs in this case, and you're going to pass them into the model, and each of these nodes will essentially kind of tweak those numbers a little bit. And depending on what you're trying to do, they'll then pass them to the nodes in the next layer. And each of those will tweak the numbers a little bit. And then you do the same thing for the next layer. And you keep going like that until you finally reach your final layer where you have what's called an activation function. You transform it into whatever kind of format your final output should be in. And then that's what you get. So it's much more complex in the algorithm that's being used, but essentially it's all the same thing. It's all, you're putting numbers in and you're doing something to those numbers and you're getting numbers out, which you then, if you're doing something like predicting text, you're decoding the output to give you a natural language response rather than a numerical response.
Right. What's fascinating to me about especially the large language model situation is at no point in time in that process is any real new information being introduced.
Yep.
Right. Because if it's simply predicting what should come next, if you ask it a question, if you go ask ChatGPT a question about, I don't know, what is contained in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, it might give you a summary. And it's not doing that because it actually knows what's in The Hobbit or what's in that book, but it might, it's going through and predicting, as you say, predictive text. It's modifying based on other inputs that it's been given. So it's been given at least the data of The Hobbit, and it's been given data about other people talking about it. So it now can learn. Well, learn is a relative term, but it can now summarize that information for you. So kind of just, I always emphasize when people ask me about this, never at any point in time are we seeing original ideas develop from this,
right?
Which I think is an incredibly important distinction to make, because that gets to some of Banjo's questions about the literary side of it, and some of the questions about, what does this mean for creativity?
Yes, that'll be interesting. But yeah, I think you said it very well. There's no new information. What's happening is, at the bottom of it, you're giving it a set of data. Mm-hmm. That data has a certain amount of novel information content in it, and it may even have some misinformation in it,
right,
as well. Probably not when you're talking about text, but someone could make, statements that are false that the model's looking at, and it's saying, oh, it has no concept of what's true and what's false. It's just looking at this word precedes this and is preceded by this, right?
Right.
And so this is what that relationship looks like. And so, you've got that novel information content, and it's finite. And you're then passing that to your model, which is learning the relationships in that data set, which you could kind of say is it's learning the information within it, right? And it's storing that in its parameters, and then it's, you let it out into the world, and it applies what it's learned to whatever new problems you give it. But yeah, ultimately, right, like if whatever you're asking it about wasn't in that original data set, it's not going to be able to do it.
Right.
And you can give it new information. Obviously, when you ask it a question, you're giving it new information. There are other methods you can use to give these LLMs more information, which again we don't need to get into. But ultimately, yeah, it can't generate something from nothing. Or at least not anything good from nothing, right? It can generate garbage from nothing, pretty much. But it's only ever going to be able to work with what you give it.
Well, and kind of to the garbage from nothing question, if you were to ask a language model like ChatGPT or one of the many others out there, write me a poem in the style of some, pick a poet, your favorite poet, I don't know. And it might be able to do it halfway decently well in that style. So the question is, can that be considered original thought?
Yeah, well, I think then, I guess here's my question to you guys. Like, when you read something that a person has written, you think it's original thought. And I think, yes, in one sense, it is original thought because a person thought it.
Right.
Right? It was new to them. But are they really creating something completely new when they do that? What do you think about that?
It's a fair question.
Because if I know, that model knows more words than you do.
Easily, yes.
And it's seen more information in the form of text than you guys have ever seen. And it can explore the possible space of, sentences, poems that you could construct with those components way quicker than you guys could. Right. So if you can write a poem, unless you're making up stuff like Lewis Carroll, and you could even tell a model to do the exact same thing, right?
And
it's read Lewis Carroll, right? What's the how different is what you're doing to the model at that point? Do you see what I'm saying?
It makes sense. Like in a way, we are internalizing our own models almost.
Well, yeah,
but there's something else there. Like we have, like you and I would say that there's something different about us from that model.
There is, but in terms of the output that you're able to produce, is it different?
I don't know the answer to that.
Because I
want to say yes, but I don't know how I would back that up.
Yeah, I mean, there are some things that I think people can produce that are novel, completely new. I think that's a capability that we have that machines do not, right? They cannot do something that is completely new in the sense of really, providing new information content. Again, I'm using information like probably the fifth different way,
right. We gotta
in this podcast, but a model really, like if you're just running a normal poem with traditional words and your arrangement is unique, well, a model could have done that.
Sure.
It could have done it. I could ask it to write me 1,000 poems a day, and it could do it. And so if a person looks at those outputs, are they going to be able to distinguish? I mean, that's the Turing test, right? Can a person differentiate when they're conversing with a machine versus with a person? And I think we've definitely crossed that mark where at least some of the time you don't know that it's a machine.
I mean, there's that online game now. Have you seen this? It's an online game where it's you log onto this website and it's just a chat box, and you just start chatting. And the goal, there's a little button that asks, "Are you chatting with a bot?" And it's a yes or no. So you have a few minutes to chat with this, and it might be another person on the same website also speaking to you. It might be a bot chatting back to you.
Now that is a good idea. Whoever had that idea, that is a good idea.
It's a fascinating game, and there's videos of people playing it, and you can go play it yourself. And I can't remember the name, but it's a ton of fun to watch because they're applying the latest bots to this, and they get pretty creative sometimes to fool you into thinking they're human, and the humans get very creative trying to make, because they're trying to fool another human on the other end, so you can get win-loss, and it's fascinating.
Oh, interesting. So you're adding an extra layer of of obfuscation there by turning it into a game. That's fun.
But yeah, it's exactly what you're talking about. Like, not everyone can distinguish whether they're talking to a human or a bot.
Yeah, and obviously, like these things are. They are machines, and they're not perfect at the moment in what they're able to produce, right? So you have a conversation long enough, you're going to figure it out. But I think that's I think that this is something that probably people are not thinking about enough with this technology. I say it like it's some kind of apocalyptic thing. I don't think it is, but it's really worth thinking about. What are you doing that's really unique? And you could say, well, my poem is unique for this reason, right? It was based on my experiences. It conveys something about the way I felt at this particular time, or the way that I grew up, or how these experiences have shaped me and shaped my way of thinking about things. And it has value for nothing else beyond the fact that it's an expression of that, right? And yeah, sure, I would agree with that. And the machine's output doesn't have any of that. Right. Unless you count its training data set as equivalent to that, which I don't. And so, but then you're asking a different question. Then you're looking at something else to distinguish your creative efforts rather than the output itself. Right. And I think it'll just be interesting to see where that goes. And another example would be with music. Am I talking too long?
No, you're great. You're great. We're here to listen to you.
Incredible. We've got all these instruments, right? But we have a finite set of instruments, each of which, is it timbre or timbre? I've heard both.
I think it depends on where you're from.
Okay, well, yeah, okay. We'll say timbre. That sounds American. It sounds more American to me.
That's so patronizing of you. I kid.
So that, they each have their unique sound, right? Like their sound waves look a little bit different to one another. They have their own unique characteristics. But you've got a finite set of them, right? And they play within this range of notes. But really, they're playing a finite set of notes unless they're badly tuned, right?
Right.
And so the type of music that we're making is using those instruments with these notes, and it comes out a particular way, right? But it's very I wouldn't say it's limited, right? Because it's even in that you have just like a phenomenal, potentially even infinite, I don't know, arrangement of music that you could compose. But with a machine, you can kind of start breaking some of those boundaries, right? Like you can say, well, what if I don't want to use a guitar? I want to use something that's like a guitar, but I've adjusted the sound wave in this particular way, and it gives it a different feel, right? And what if I want to? I don't know if you would want to do this, right? Like, how far do you have to stray before it becomes cacophonous? I don't know, but you could start using different notes, right? And you could maybe go between. I don't know that much about music, but you could go between the typical definition of those notes.
And people do that even before the advent of being able to use computers for that.
Yeah.
Not too long ago, I think Paul Simon, not his most recent album, but maybe the one before that, can't remember, having not kept up with Paul Simon as I used to. He created an album where they invented instruments for this album because there were tones he wanted to use here. And it was interesting, but also, it started to get, it was not in tune with the standard musical sensibilities.
Yeah.
So there were some songs I was like, I just didn't, some of it just came off odd to me.
Yeah.
Some people loved it.
It's, well, that's the thing is it's probably going to be pretty wild,
right?
And you question whether you really want to hear that. But I mean, they did the same thing with Dune. They made instruments for that. For
right,
the soundtrack
they did.
For that, which was really interesting.
That came off a lot better.
Yeah, that was phenomenal.
That was pretty spectacular.
But so what is AI doing in that? Well, it's not going to do it by itself, but it can do it if a person tells it to do it. And then that this is really what's kind of most exciting about AI. We'll get back to the depressing stuff, I guess, depending on your view in a minute. But, here now you've got a tool which you can use to explore all of those possibilities so much more quickly, so much more efficiently, right? Like if I was a musician, I could say, all right, here's my set of instruments and here's the style that I like. I want you to write me 100 riffs a day or 1,000 riffs, whatever you get done, right? I'm going to leave you running all the time and pick the 10 best based on this criteria that I've defined. And send them to me and I'll listen to them. And, maybe I like them, maybe I don't know. But that creative process now, it's not just you, it's this machine helping you with that, right? And really that's kind of, I think for the large part, what people are doing, maybe that is just exclusively what people are doing. I don't know. It's a question I have in my own mind is how different really are we when we're doing something creative like that to just doing what the machine is doing. But
interesting.
You're gonna be able to use that to augment or accelerate your own work, right? It's a tool for that purpose. It's a tool for sharing information, synthesizing information, exploring possibilities, and that's what's exciting about it. And rather than what's scary about it.
There's at least in the corporate world, there's a depressing side, I think, that's going to happen where people are going to have AI write this email for me, and they're going to send that email. On the other side, they're going to say, AI synthesize this information for me. And so you end up with the same input and output, but the AI wrote multiple paragraphs of an email to somebody in between that's never written or read.
And then the problem is someone's going to say, you know what we should do? We should write a bot that is going to look through all of our old emails and it's going to tell us what we say in answer to people's questions. And all it's going to look back through is AI generated emails.
That will happen. Well, actually, that almost happened. I was on a project where they decided they wanted to implement an AI chatbot on this website to answer people's common questions. The funny part was they weren't even going to use AI because they were going to handwrite each response. And if there wasn't a direct response to someone's question, then they were going to still forward an email to somebody. So it wasn't even really AI, but that's kind of what they were having someone manually do, was go through and try to scrape all these questions that had been answered out of emails.
Mm-hmm.
But it's funny you say that because we literally just had a meeting about this a couple of weeks ago. And anyway.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people are going to be...
But they're going to be doing that.
Experiencing that. And I mean, we had it today. I had my... couple of meetings today actually, which is I haven't experienced this before, but a couple of people sent their note taker AI into the meeting.
Yes,
and in one instance, the person wasn't actually there, and so I thought, okay, well, was he not there because he couldn't make it, or because he didn't want to make it? Right? I don't know what his motivations are, But and then it's like, well, what do you do if you only have these AIs in the meeting, right? What happens if everyone checks out and just decides? And I think this is so,
Wow.
when you're thinking about, I keep saying when you're thinking about AI, but when you're thinking about, the types of things that it can produce, you have to have some way of injecting this differentiation in there, almost, right? This exploration of things that are not typical. Because you've got all of the, you've looked through so much text. You probably have every word in the English language in there at some point, except for maybe, domain-specific terminology. But how can you inject, some element of randomness into that, such that you're not just basically go on this like continuously degenerative path where you've got an AI producing, some content, and it's really not novel, and then another AI produces some content on the basis of that, and it's not novel. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent.
Well, that's interesting. Have you heard about the dead internet theory?
No.
So the dead internet theory is that basically sometime in the late 2010s, bots became so prevalent online that the majority of internet traffic is bot traffic, and that the majority of your interactions online are bots, and that in fact the internet is quote unquote dead, and that most ideas, or that any new ideas, are generated by a minority on the internet, and there's so that actual real human beings make up a minority of the internet use is the theory.
Interesting.
And I don't know if I would take it as far as to call it a dead internet, but there is a substantial amount of data about the number of bots. It's well over 25% of internet traffic. I'm not sure if it's over 50%, but it's over 25%. So I'm not sure I go so far as to call it dead, but it's
only going to go up.
It's significant, and it's what you're talking about. And these bots, we have scrapers to generate social media posts and blog articles that are then scraped by more bots to generate more of that. Yeah. And we were doing that before the AI boom. Yeah. Anyway, so it just substantiates some of what you're talking about. I think the same thing will happen.
Yeah. It's I can imagine it. I mean, I think you're already going to be seeing it, right? Mm-hmm. Probably a lot of and this is so a company we have a close relationship with is Databricks, and Databricks is trying to position themselves as a data intelligence platform, right? So they want to do all things AI, and they basically, they matched, I think it was GPT 3.5. They matched its performance on a certain number of benchmarks with a significantly reduced training set.
That's impressive.
But they were able to do it because they basically filtered out all the crap in the original training set.
I see.
And that kind of just speaks to like how much quality data is really out there in all of that, right? And that's a part of it, is like, if you can figure out, well, this was generated by a bot. Well, if I have the content that this bot was trained on, then I don't actually need that bot's output, right?
Right.
I've already got the information that this bot used to produce it.
You would still have to synthesize it yourself, though, into use.
You would. You still need to train your model.
Of some sort, right? Yeah.
Yeah. You'd still want to include that in your training set if it had novel information content in it. But you want to exclude those things because by definition they're not going to be novel. They're going to be a regurgitation of something that's existing. And there's all kinds of other junk as well out there besides just AI generated stuff.
It's like when GPT bubbles up some random Reddit answer to the question of, there was something really dumb, like is car oil edible or something. I can't remember what it was. Of course, some Reddit troll was saying, yeah, you can put in all this stuff and like you can do all these things with it. And ChatGPT responded for a brief period of time to somebody asking that same question before it got flagged and changed manually.
Oh, really? Well, I've had a funny interaction with that. I was building something to translate some code, and I wanted to test it out. And I just said, write me some Python code to print "Hello World."
Right.
And what it returned was basically a Stack Overflow exchange.
Like not actually a Hello World program.
Yeah, the first thing was someone saying, "This doesn't work," and then the response was like, "Have you tried this?" It's like, this is not
what I asked for. World. That's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had some of those similar interactions for sure. I've been a lot more impressed by its ability to have more meaningful. At least it kind of less technical conversations. I do feel like when it is in the more technical realm, the code side still isn't there. I'm not entirely sure why. I feel like that should have been an easier problem for it to solve.
Yeah, it all just depends on having a sufficient quantity of good data.
Okay.
And it also depends on if you're generating code, like how similar is what you're trying to do to what's already been done.
That makes sense.
But yeah, I mean, generally I find them to be at least on like, relatively simple problems. They're extremely impressive.
And it's
out
fast.
Of the box. Yeah.
I like that. Yeah. Banjo, I've been hogging the mic here. I know you've got some questions. We are getting close to the end of our time. So, ask your final questions and your doom and gloom end of world theories.
Well, really, I feel mischaracterized. I'm not really
sorry.
as
You're just always over here on about the end of creativity and.
No, I really am not. I mean, I have my moments where I can get a little Eeyore, but in general, I think that the act of creativity and the act of producing art is so different from what AI does that it at this point I've started to believe that it doesn't even really it almost doesn't merit a debate. It really comes to like, do you actually have an understanding of what art is? And
which I don't.
To tell the truth, most people don't.
But
and
so
I would.
Can you substantiate?
That? Go. I missed that. Go ahead.
Well, so can you I'm curious. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm curious. Why do you think that? What's the argument there? Why is it so different?
Sorry. Why is it so?
Why do you think it's so different?
Like
AI,
also
what
AI generated stuff?
Yeah. Well, I think one book I've been reading recently is David Mamet's The Three Uses of the Knife, which is essentially his kind of recapitulation of Aristotle's Poetics, which is just exactly as exciting as it sounds for most people, but for me, it's the all-star game. But anyway, he makes the claim that the purpose of art is, his word is cleansing awe. Aristotle's word, of course, is catharsis. And I really like Mamet's word there of cleansing awe. And he says, really, the purpose of art is to wake us up to our powerlessness, is to wake us up to the fact that we don't have power or strength in the world, and to put us into a position, basically, that draws us to worship, essentially. And I don't think a machine is capable of doing that, because I don't think that a machine is capable of worship, or at least not anywhere in the realm of what a human is capable of. And so I think when you go to a movie that is good, you go to a movie that is worth watching, you leave it with some sense of kind of awe, with some sense of the sublime, maybe to use a different word. You leave usually, I think, with some sense of your finitude, and to put it in a really negative way, kind of your worthlessness, but also probably, hopefully, of your worth. There's some paradox there. I'm also in the English major camp, in the poets camp, more than I am in the philosophers camp, and so my language is like all over the place. And I apologize to the philosophers in the room. But I don't. Yeah. So those are things that I don't think that that AI can do, because I don't think it has a sense of those things. I think you actually have to have consciousness in order to achieve that. And since AI doesn't have that, since ChatGPT doesn't have that, it can't do it. And I think the fun part of that is, hopefully that forces humans to get much better at art. Hopefully it forces us to get much better at producing works of catharsis, works of cleansing awe. I think we're very, very good at that. And so I'm at this moment very optimistic about the future of art. But I think I can only have reason to be optimistic if we continue to come to a better understanding of what art is. So anyway, that's my long-winded answer. I don't know if that's useful or not.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think, I guess, because so you're talking about catharsis on the part of the consumer of the art, I suppose. Correct. I mean, what is the
Right.
even if so think about it like this though. Every everything that a model is trained on, everything that it looks at, with some exceptions, which we've talked about, is going to be produced by a person. So it's going to look at all of those things and see these are the elements of a movie or a picture or a poem, and it's going to have all of that knowledge. It's going to have, understanding. I say understanding, not literal understanding, right? But understanding in the sense of being able to kind of reproduce all of those relationships that are present in those works of art. And so, what's to stop it from being able to reproduce that in a different form? That's the argument there, right? And even what's to stop it from using different pieces that it knows exist, but which maybe haven't been used in those forms before, and putting them there and creating something that's akin to those other things. And so to me, that's just a question of, again, back to information. It all boils down to information. Are you producing something that is completely novel when you're doing it? And by completely novel, I don't mean you've made a film that no one's produced before, because I think that's pretty easy to do. Maybe not easy to do well, obviously. But you're using pieces that everybody knows exist already. You're maybe doing it in a genre, unless you're creating a new genre, right? You're probably doing it in a genre that already exists, and so that all that stuff is there as well for the machine to look at and to learn from, and to create after those things, right? Create in the likeness of those things. So I guess that's my response to that. What do you think about that?
Well, that's definitely within the realm of possibility, and you would know better than I. So yeah, I think that's pretty interesting, and I think it will be pretty fascinating to see. One thing I continue to be intrigued by is AI's ability to analyze and to kind of sort data. I think I'm using that term correctly now. Maybe not. But to sort information in a way that makes it much easier to process. That I found very impressive. I have high hopes for how creatives can use that in the future. Maybe my last question, though, to you would be, before we wrap up here, are there any, you answered this partially, I think, already, but are there any specific blind spots that you think that the Christian community in particular maybe is missing when it comes to AI, when it comes to information, to technology? Are there any areas as Christians, maybe in particular, that we should be talking about that we're ignoring at this point?
Well, I think that really the conversation we should be having, and I think we are having it, but not exactly in this context, is what does it mean to be made in the image of God? That to me is the question that if you know the answer to that, then you can exactly differentiate people from these things, right? Because you can't do it. Yeah, it sounds like we disagree about that, but that's okay. But in my opinion, you can't do it based on what we produce. At least in the examples that we've been talking about, maybe there are some things that people can create that's not just a recombination of existing stuff. It really is genuinely completely new. So maybe there's some stuff like that, but it's I think it's probably primarily not in what we produce. It's in something else. And so the question is, what is that, and what does it mean to be made in the image of God? That is something that is unique to us as humans in creation, and I think is going to be, I suppose the response to to this new age of AI that we're in, because the capabilities of this technology are only going to increase. And the differentiating between man and machine is only going to get more difficult. And that's not in a doomsday type way, but just the capabilities are going to be there, and it's going to more and more resemble the cognitive things that people do that previously made us unique. And now we're not unique for those things. And so we need to find now really what are the ways that we are unique, that's never gonna disappear. Kind of like avoiding God of the gaps, but for what makes man, right?
Right.
So I think that's a key question. I think that debate is being had, but it's more in the realm of sexuality and self-identification, I suppose, rather than in that particular regard at the moment.
That makes sense.
No, that's great. That gives a lot to think on and mull on. So yeah, thanks for that response.
Do you think for young men particularly, and this is my final question, for young men particularly, is there something you would want them to be especially aware of as they engage with these tools?
Does something come to mind for you? Get me started on that.
Well, I've been reading this book, Digital Liturgies, by Samuel D. James. It's a Crossway publication. And he digs into especially how the internet is a tool that highlights kind of our consumption, and a tool that the very way it's designed communicates particular kinds of messages over and above others. Things it's easier to get involved in an angry conversation online. It's easier to shame someone online. Just those are some of the examples he goes into. He has a fascinating chapter on how the internet doesn't just contain pornography; it acts as pornography in the way it presents itself to us as an object to be consumed. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about, and that's with the kind of the old internet as we know it. And the internet is shifting even today. These tools are shifting. The ability to create 1,000 variations on a riff for a song is now something that's out there. So are there ways to be thinking about this? Are there things that as a young person, if you were to go speak to a younger Ben who's entering all of this, what warnings would you give, and what encouragements would you give in that?
It's a difficult question. Well, probably, I guess a warning would be I guess I would try to hang on to or emphasize things that I think traditionally have made people's lives meaningful, which not even just in the last 5 years, but really over the past generation or two, have kind of disappeared. And one of those key things is relationship with people, with other men, with with your wife or whatever, with your family, with your church, with your local community. Those things add a lot of meaning to life, are extremely important in life. I think there's obviously biblical warrant for that. And there's not, those things aren't extinct online, but they're harder to find. And obviously a lot of those relationships are not going to be meaningful. So I guess that's what I'd say. And I think that's probably part of just having a Christian attitude, a Christian worldview, and recognizing things that are actually meaningful and actually of value versus things that are not. And I think you put it well, things that are of something that is for consumption versus something that is actually sustaining and substantive. So I guess that's maybe a warning and advice. I don't know. Don't be afraid of it. I don't know. I'm not.
That's good advice. You don't hear many people say that.
Yeah, well, I don't think you need to be. I mean, really, see this as this is something that is going to enable people to be even more what makes them unique. Right?
Interesting.
I don't mean that on an individual level, right? But obviously applies at that level. But really, for mankind in general, right? What is it that makes us unique? We're not going to have to spend time doing these things before that now a machine can do. We can do things that are more meaningful and more valuable. And so we can focus on that. And that's an exciting thing. So that's what I would say. Be familiar with it. Don't be concerned about it. And think about, develop a robust view of what makes you valuable and meaningful, and the same for other people, and the same for, Banjo, to your point, the things that they create, because, you, by virtue of creating it, that you've imbued some value to the thing that you created, even if a machine could have done the same thing. A machine did it because of the weights and probabilities that were in its architecture. You did it because of, if you want to be a materialist, you could say, well, you did it for the same reasons, right? But we're not materialists here, right? You did it because of some emotion or some desire, whatever that you had, and I think that gives those things meaning as well, and it's worthwhile thinking about those things, and not just thinking about the surface level of what you can see or what you can consume.
Well, very good. On that note, I think you brought some books, so if you have any you would like to recommend to listeners to explore this further.
Sure, let me grab them.
Sure. While you do that, I'm going to reiterate the recommendation for this book, Digital Liturgies, Rediscovering Christian Wisdom in an Online Age by Samuel D. James. It's a more recent Crossway publication, I think in the last 3 or 4 years. It was recommended to me. I haven't quite finished it. I've got one chapter to go, but I've very much enjoyed it. Highly recommend it to folks that are interested in exploring how we interact with these tools.
That does sound like an interesting book. So a couple I mentioned. One is Luciano Floridi, A Very Short Introduction to Information. So if you want to learn a little bit more, this is just a very kind of, I'd say fairly thorough, but brief and maybe in philosophical terms, overview of the field of philosophy of information. There's also, again, I mentioned it, but I'll mention it here, Conversations with a Mathematician by Gregory Chaitin, which slightly different view of information, what defines the information content of something. But if you're interested in a more mathy side, in the unknowable, that's a really interesting book. And then a couple I have here are from Discovery Institute, or people that are with the Discovery Institute. So one is Non-Computable You by Robert Marks. I haven't actually read this book myself, but this is kind of that question we were just talking about. What is it that makes man unique? What is it that makes man distinct to machine? And that's kind of the key topic of discussion in this book, I suppose. So those are probably the three I would go with. And then the final one I have here is called The Human Advantage by Jay Richards. And that's on a similar topic, what makes humans unique and better than machines in certain ways. And it's definitely a more kind of simple starting point, I suppose, to maybe Non-Computable You.
Okay. Very good. Banjo, do you have any good books you've been reading on the subject, good podcasts to recommend?
No, nothing on this subject. All of my reading has been frightfully old-fashioned. But I have been watching a few videos from Simon Sinek. He had a few YouTube videos that I thought were interesting. Most of them were that I saw were from several years ago, so they may be out of date. But I don't know. I thought he had some things that were worth thinking about. So if you haven't taken a look at any of his videos, worth checking him out, Simon Sinek.
Well, very good. As a reminder, we are in the middle of a challenge revolving around technology. Very simple, just to get you thinking about some of this stuff. You can get as heady as you want, or you can be as practical as you want. Challenges last for 6 weeks, so that's a total of 42 days. They are simple daily tasks to grow us as Christian men, and the current challenge is to simply turn your phone completely off for 1 hour every day.
This has been the Forging Honor podcast. Music and production is by Elliot George. For more information about what we do or to learn how to get involved, visit our website at forginghonor.com. There you'll find information about our community, The Forge, and how to join other young men seeking to glorify God in thought, word, and deed. You'll also find blog articles, book recommendations, and more ways to grow as a Christian man.
If you enjoyed the show, please tell a friend or family member about Forging Honor. We would also appreciate it if you would take a moment to like and subscribe. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, a rating and review only takes a moment, and it goes a long way towards growing the Forging Honor community.
Thanks for taking the time with us today. We hope you'll take up the work alongside us and join us in the task of Forging Honor. We'll see you next time.